Hello, my name is Janie Collins, and I study the Boxer Uprising of 1900. In the fall of 1898, northern China became home to a group of young martial artists who called themselves the Yihetuan, which roughly translated means the Boxers United in Righteousness. That's where we get the name Boxers. And their goal was simple. They wanted to support the Qing and destroy the foreign. They wanted to revitalize the reigning Qing dynasty over China at the time, and do so by expelling foreign influence, which had been growing since the 1860s with the Opium Wars and the many unequal treaties and concessions that Western nations had been taking from China at the time. And so in 1898, these young martial artists banded together, and they received international attention, and there's all this drama around the Boxer Uprising, mostly because of the siege that they waged in Beijing. From June 22nd to August 14 of 1900, the Boxers laid siege to the foreign quarter of Beijing, and it was only ended when a massive international relief force of 20,000 soldiers from 8 different nations arrived in the city to put an end to the uprising. Now, in all this discussion of the Boxers, as I was doing my research on this topic, I was noticing that there was a ton of attention being made on what was happening to the foreigners and not so much on what was happening to the Chinese casualties of the event. Between fall of 1898 and the end of the siege in 1900, about 200 foreigners were killed by the Boxers. That's the same number as fits in your average American movie theater. At the same time, along that same time frame, the Boxers killed 20,000 Chinese Christians. That's the same number as fits in a sold-out concert at the Staples Center in LA. Pretty big difference. And I wanted to know, why is the focus so much on the foreigners and not so much on the Chinese Christians? Is this simple just bias for Westerners over Chinese people, or is there more to the story? In addition, I wanted to know what makes members of an anti-foreign Chinese movement kill mostly just other Chinese people. Initially, my thought was that this movement cannot have been as anti-foreign as we once thought, and that historical accounts need to be changed to be more inclusive of the Chinese Christian experience. However, as I dug into my research, I learned I was mostly wrong, but I was onto something very right. The Boxers were an anti-foreign movement, and their issue with Chinese Christians was primarily stirred up by the imbalance of power that favored Chinese Christians, the power of Western imperialism in northern China. Chinese Christians took advantage of that, and there are multiple accounts to support that, and that was very frustrating to community members of northern China. In addition, however, the Boxers saw conversion to Christianity as a rejection of what they believed it meant to be Chinese. So they're saying, you've rejected your Chineseness by becoming a Christian, and so that's why the movement was anti-foreign in that sense. But in addition to what I was learning about Boxers and their anti-foreignism, I also learned a lot about Chinese Christians and their experience of the uprising. My sources, in terms of primary sources, came primarily from missionary accounts, specifically American missionary women. They were the few English sources I could find that discuss specifically the experiences of Chinese Christians. There are not many Chinese Christian stories that have been translated into English. So to balance out the missionary accounts, I also relied on the Shanghai-based, widely read North China Herald, as well as a few other newspaper sources, correspondences between the Qing government and foreign governments at the time, and then I also looked at the placards posted by Boxers in cities around northern China. And from these sources, what I learned was that Chinese Christians experienced both agency and silencing throughout the Boxer Uprising. In terms of agency, one of the biggest ways that I saw this was in the inter-village warfare that was going on before the uprising reached its apex in Beijing. Chinese Catholics actively took a defense against the Boxers. They wanted to defend their villages. All Catholic villages banded together. They prepared weapons. They fought back against the Boxers. There were these pitched battles that would go on between Boxers and Catholic villages. So it wasn't this story of just these victims getting slaughtered en masse. They were taking an active role in what was going on around them. In addition, they participated in the siege of Beijing. They ran messages across enemy lines. They helped build barricades. Specialists like watchmakers were employed to improve ammunitions. and make guns. There was one Chinese Christian who was really proud of the role that he got to play in the uprising, in the siege, excuse me. And he described his experience where he was sent to watch over this watchtower that was a very dangerous position. And so he describes his experience. He said, "We could never look through a loophole without danger of receiving a bullet in the face. So a mirror was placed near the loophole in such a position that it would reflect the advancing enemy, and we would sit hour by hour with our eyes fixed on this mirror." So this Chinese Christian man was very proud of the role that he got to play in the defense of the siege, an active participant in what was going on. And then after the uprising, there was also a lot of retaliation. Chinese Christians, again, resumed the inter-village warfare and attacked those who had given them over to the Boxers or the Boxers themselves. So they were, again, actively participating in what was happening to them, not just passive victims. In addition to all the agency, however, there was also incredible silencing that was going on. In the early part of the movement, the Chinese Christian experience was largely ignored by both the Qing and foreign governments. The foreign governments had gotten involved when Chinese Christians raised the alarm of what was going on to the missionary societies they were connected to, and those missionary societies brought the foreign governments in. But because no foreigners were being killed, they didn't really do much to protect the Chinese Christians. In fact, from the fall of 1898 until May of 1900, only one foreigner was killed by Boxers. Meanwhile, thousands of Chinese Christians were being slaughtered. And the foreign governments didn't do anything. In addition, the Chinese government did little, but that had more to do with their fears of inciting a huge rebellion like the Taiping Rebellion, which had happened 30 years earlier, and a similar aggressive group like the Boxers with different ideology had rose up, and they didn't want to start something like that again, and so they were afraid of antagonizing the Boxers too early on. So they pretty much left the Chinese Christians to suffer what was going on without any imperial support. And then in addition, during the siege, although Chinese Christians were active participants and helped out and were happy to help in a lot of ways, there was also a lot of exploitation that was going on. Mostly in these kinds of situations, refugees who would be prioritized would be the women and children. However, in the Boxer Uprising or in the siege, it was kind of a backwards system of relief. You could only access food and resources if you were an able-bodied male who could provide labor. And these laborers, who were volunteers, would be given meal tickets, and those would allow them access to food and resources. So if you were a woman or a child, old, sick, you didn't have access to food. And so this unequal system continued through the uprising. And then lastly, in the indemnification process, Chinese Christians were excluded purposefully from the reparations process that was created after the uprising. So as I look back at the story of Chinese Christians in the Boxer Uprising, we've been perpetuating, as historians, perpetuating this silencing that's been going on. And so I want to encourage myself and other historians to rewrite the narrative, bring the Chinese Christians back into the story, and tell the Boxer Uprising in terms of this experience of agency and silencing for the Chinese Christians. Thank you.